Some people say comprehensible input is the only way to learn a language, but if it is, why do so many people say it's a waste of time? I used it to learn Spanish and I saw genuine results, but also found out why so many learners get stuck. So in this video, I'm going to break down exactly what comprehensible input is, whether the critics are actually right, and what you can do about it to get some serious results. Before we get into that, if you want to jumpstart your learning, then Story Learning's Black Friday sale is on now with courses in 17 languages at more than half price. The sale isn't on for long, so check out the link in the description to make the most of it while it lasts. Right. So that you can understand the criticism of it, let's quickly look at where comprehensible input comes from, because it's essential to fully understand what it was reacting against when it was proposed. This is just going to be a run through of the highlights before someone comes at me in the comments. You can do some more research if you fancy. So, before comprehensible input, one of the dominant ways of learning languages was by drilling exact phrases and trying to avoid errors by being corrected early so that any mistakes didn't get ingrained. You can imagine classes of students repeating phrases over and over again until they got them right. The origin of this was actually influenced by the psychological behaviorist model, which is a whole other thing that we don't have time to get into today. But some people felt that after years of drilling correct phrases, they still couldn't speak fluently or understand native speakers. Just repeating a sentence looks like performing the language, but it isn't the same as having genuine competence. People seem to be missing a key component, and so things started to change in the 50s when the linguist Noam Chomsky criticized this approach, saying that it couldn't describe how some people can understand and say sentences that they've never heard before. And so if this behaviorist approach couldn't explain first language ability, why would it apply to a second language? So there had to be something that explained this idea of language learning in a way that was different from this behaviorist or audiolingual model that was around at the time. And that, my friends, is where comprehensible input came in the 70s. It was one of the 5 hypotheses proposed by Stephen Krashen and later published in his book with Tracy Tyrrell, The Natural Approach. And although a lot has changed in applied linguistics since then, they made the distinction between learning a language and acquiring it. So in contrast with just repeating set phrases, they suggested that language learning is more about picking up implicitly, so without formal study, the same as your first language. Central to this is their idea that we acquire languages when we understand what's going on. Of course, that might mean words, but of course things like gestures, tone of voice and context can give your brain clues to work out the meaning behind what someone is saying. As you pick up more words from context, your brain can use those to fill in the blanks as it gets more exposure. As you get better, you can focus on increasingly more difficult content. The trick is finding content that you understand enough of in order to allow your brain to fill in those gaps. Now, as an idea, comprehensible input is just one hypothesis of how we learn languages amongst decades of research. There's the output hypothesis, the interaction hypothesis, as well as loads more recent theories and ideas. But within the field of applied linguistics, it gets criticized for being difficult to measure or test, alongside the fact that it's pretty vague. Despite that, it's had a huge impact on how we think about language learning and has become the umbrella term for loads of creators making videos for language learners trying to follow the principles from Krashen and Tyrrell. But since appearing everywhere, there are now countless videos criticizing it and often saying that it doesn't work. Such is the nature of the internet. It's very difficult to have a nuanced discussion. Being angry, negative, or opinionated frankly just gets more clicks. So I'm going to try and be brave here and look at some of the criticisms leveled at it in order to help you learn a language better. We're going to look at the problems and practical things you can do to avoid wasting time on things that don't work. So I'm going to jump in at the deep end here because you've got things to do, and also this gets to the heart of the criticisms against CI. So comprehensible input is generally associated with Krashen and Tyrrell, as I've mentioned, but someone else associated with it very closely is Professor Bill Van Patten, who I've interviewed on the channel. So for context, Van Patten is an absolute legend in the field of linguistics. Not only did he publish numerous books and papers, but he also had a couple of radio shows where he shared language learning advice for teachers, and also created a comprehensible input show to learn Spanish back in the day called Destinos. But I think what Van Patten says gets to the heart of many discussions about comprehensible input and language learning more generally. He makes a distinction between the natural acquisition of a language and what he calls language-like behavior. So, what does that mean? Well, if you think of it like this, language acquisition is this idea that your brain will pick up the language with enough material that it mostly understands. That can include videos designed for learners where the speaker is using vocabulary tailored to your level. You're trying to build a network in your brain supposedly in the same way that you did for your native language. The idea is that with constant exposure, you're making multiple connections between different words and ideas, and then you can spontaneously put together new sentences down the line. Although it is worth pointing out that even a CI supporter like Van Patten says that there is a role for explicit teaching. That can help people notice some of the nuances that can impact the meaning of the language that they're learning. So, what the hell is language-like behavior then? Well, if the goal of language acquisition is to build this dynamic and long-lasting system that works like your native language, in this context, people could argue that language-like behavior would be memorizing and repeating isolated phrases or words. The point being that that's not how native speakers automatically construct new phrases. They're not following a script. And you could even argue that something like language islands is like following a script for some people. If you haven't heard of them, this is where people memorize sentences about topics that they want to talk about and then repeat them in a conversation. It comes from Boris Shechtman's book, How to Improve Your Foreign Language Immediately, which I think is a hilarious title. But whilst repeating memorized phrases on the surface might look like speaking the language, because those words could be identical to what a proficient speaker might say, the argument is that it's not necessarily the same process as how a native speaker would construct those phrases. It's kind of like being in a new city and only being able to follow Google Maps without knowing how to deviate. As soon as your phone runs out of battery, you get lost, versus just knowing the way and alternate routes if you need to pick up a coffee before your final destination. In fact, I remember reading that one of the criticisms of Shechtman's language islands was that they create the illusion of fluency. Basically, if you stick to the script, you're fine, but you might struggle as soon as a conversation goes off track, which is why he suggested that you try and steer the conversation to talk about the topics that you've covered in your language islands. And I think we've all met people like that at one party or another. The suggestion is that there are basically different processes happening in the brain between picking up patterns in the language through exposure compared with just memorizing phrases. But in fact, I think that this is where things get interesting, because in people arguing for one or the other, I think there's an implicit value judgment that one is better than the other and that one is good and one is bad. People can get very picky about what language learning is on both sides of the debate. Let's be honest. If I'm on holiday, I might not have all day to wait to construct an implicit system in my head of the local language, because when I really need a coffee, I can just repeat a few words that I've memorized and it results in me getting a coffee. That's still a win. It doesn't mean though that I can understand what someone says back to me, but you have got to start somewhere, right? But on the other side of the coin, if someone is focusing on comprehensible input to learn a language, they're improving their understanding as they get more exposure. And if it's working for them, it also doesn't make sense to say that they're doing language learning wrong. I don't know about you, but I'm far too busy focused on what I'm doing to worry if people are learning languages differently from me. So what does this mean for your own language learning? Let's look at some of the more specific criticisms of comprehensible input and the changes that you can make to improve your language skills faster. As I've mentioned, comprehensible input is actually a really old theory and has been criticized for a long time. Some people suggest that getting exposure to the language is literally all you need to get fluent. Just like watching lots of videos and as soon as you open your mouth, you'll be able to speak perfect French. I spent a long time getting exposure to Spanish, and I know from experience that it just doesn't work that way. And that is one of the biggest criticisms. People say that input isn't enough, that you absolutely have to do more things like learn about the grammar, study vocabulary, actively practice speaking. And here's where some nuance comes in, which I know on the internet is a pretty dangerous thing, But in considering whether input alone is enough, when thinking about the answer, generally I would say no, especially if you want to speak well. A really useful thing I've found is talking to yourself a lot. You'll find the gaps in your vocabulary as well as reinforce the words that you already know. And you can quickly look up anything that you need to and then try and use it as much as possible. There's evidence that there are other factors you need to reach a high level, which includes more explicit knowledge about, say, grammar rules, especially if they don't exist in your native language. Spanish subjunctive, I'm looking at you. So don't be a hero and assume that you only have to watch videos to pick up the language. The benefit adults have over children is that you know stuff. You can use your advanced powers of reasoning to understand things much faster. On top of that, certainly I didn't realize how many minor mistakes I was making in my Spanish when it came to genders, because it never got in the way of comprehension. So doing something extra like journaling made a huge difference for me. However, I'm not saying everybody absolutely has to do the same thing. If we look at the question again, is input alone enough? Well, it entirely depends on what you think enough is. Sometimes when people have arguments on the internet, they're talking about different things, as we've mentioned, not just in terms of what language learning is, but also their personal goals. Not everybody learning a language wants or even needs to take it to the most advanced level that they possibly can. And in that instance, actually just getting tons of exposure to the language and having lots of interesting conversations with tutors online could well be enough for their personal goals, as well as being enjoyable. But things will look different for different people. If you're going on holiday to Germany, just watching a few comprehensible input videos on YouTube the day before you leave isn't going to help you get around. I'd argue that everybody's entitled to have a different approach, and so the value judgment of whether something is right or wrong is entirely subjective. So for the question of whether or not input alone is enough, well, the answer is it depends. Enough for what? And I'd also add that you can end up going to the opposite extreme and learn everything there is to know about grammar in a language, as well as memorizing tons of vocabulary. But then after all of those hours in front of a textbook, you might have no idea what people say when they're talking to you. The question then is, how much exposure have you had to the language at a level you can mostly understand? And then so the answer is comprehensible input. And I'll also add, how much are you enjoying your language learning? You don't have to hate every second of it, and it seems a shame to me that some people think that the actual language learning process is something that they have to get through, which leads me onto one of the biggest criticisms of comprehensible input. So one thing you'll hear all the time is people saying that this comprehensible input approach is slow and hard to implement. So let's look at those each in turn, starting with it's too slow. Firstly, there is no way around it. To commit a word to your long-term memory, regardless of method, generally you need to be exposed to it multiple times. The most common words come up all the time, but after a while, certain words come up less often, and so you'll be exposed to them less frequently, which means that it will take longer to get that repeated exposure to reinforce them. Now, loads of people use flashcards to get around this. Not to split hairs on this, but depending on the sorts of flashcards you use and how you use them, you could argue that if the input from flashcards is comprehensible to you, then it's comprehensible input. But there are various ways to get that repetition aside from normal digital flashcards. I hate Anki, for example, so I started recording voice memos with the chunks and phrases that I wanted to review. The problem is that after a while you end up with tons of voice notes and it gets hard to review them all. So a simple solution I found was to record your own voice using audio flashcards. There are similar apps out there. The one that I use is audio-flashcards.com. I will say, I don't like the latest update to the algorithm, so I would recommend using their legacy algorithm, which you can find listed under experimental features in the app if you try it. Using that, I can listen when I'm walking, driving, cleaning, whatever, and it gives me those repeated exposures that makes it easier to remember words. But I think there is something that's more important than repetition. Your brain is not a hard drive. You are a person with thoughts and feelings, I assume, and you need to work with that when learning a new language. If you're doing supposedly the most efficient activity, whatever that would be, but you quit because you hate it, well, then you've stopped. So that isn't faster than picking up the language through lots of exposure. For me, I think that one of the biggest risks for learners is that they don't stick with it long enough to see meaningful progress. And so on the one hand, actively reviewing my audio flashcards is time efficient, but actually just getting lots of exposure to the language through interesting podcasts or shows is energy efficient. And so I can do more of it. Doing something simple like watching videos or listening to podcasts not only helps you pick up the language, but more importantly for less experienced learners, changes your habits and identity. And over the long term, that is huge. It's hard to make real progress if you feel like you're forcing yourself to learn a language. But by doing simple things like enjoying content from Comprehensible Input style creators, you can change your perception of difficulty. And not only over time increase the difficulty of the content you use to learn the language, but also do increasingly difficult things as your attitude to learning changes with experience. So the slow and steady approach of using simple content is actually really smart in the long term. Habits and psychology are essential for success, which is why I made them the center of the course that I teach. If you don't have the right approach, learning a language will feel much harder than it needs to. So next, let's look at that second criticism, that it's hard to implement. Well, in the modern world, it just isn't as hard. It depends on the language you're learning, of course, as well as what resources are available, but you can often find tons of stuff on YouTube or even going to comprehensibleinputwiki.org where there are lists of resources available for each language. On top of that, you can also use AI to write a detailed prompt and get tailored text and audio at a level specific to you. Even just a combo of ChatGPT, Notebook LM, and your imagination, you can do a lot. The main thing to remember is that it needs to be at a level you can understand, which is why I don't tend to use the word immersion, as you can be surrounded by the language, but if you can't understand anything, it's not that helpful. Your brain won't have enough clues to fill in the blanks. Now, understanding can involve using context, but also translations to make sense of things. That's another tool that you didn't have when it came to learning your first language. So comprehensible input doesn't have to be a passive thing if you're trying to actively make sense of the content you're using. That's where transcripts and repeated listening to a podcast can really help. So coming full circle, back to Bill Van Patten and this idea of CI versus language-like activities, he said that language-like activities are similar to the training wheels on a bike. In order to learn to ride a bike, you can use the training wheels to get going, but eventually you won't need them. And that's why it makes sense to use whatever you personally find beneficial without losing sight of the fact that you need a huge amount of exposure in order to build up this network of data in your head. So by using a combination of things like videos made for learners as well as other activities, you can get the best of both worlds. I do loads more stuff on top of just enjoying content in the language that I'm learning. If you want to see how I put this into practice, check out this next video where you'll see what my actual routine looks like.